The wind tasted of grit and sorrow. Nora guided the old mare along the ridge, her black morning dress collecting a fine red dust that clung like a second skin. Below, the Double Creek Ranch sprawled in the long afternoon shadows, a place that had been her whole world for 5 years. Today, it felt like a stranger's land. The funeral was over. James was in the ground, and the emptiness that had been a dull ache in her chest was now a hollow cavern the wind howled through. She had cried until her eyes were raw, but the Arizona sun had baked the tears dry on her cheeks, leaving them tight and burning. The horse needed no direction, its hooves finding the familiar path home. Home. The word felt foreign, a coin from a country she could no longer visit. As she rounded the last bend toward the cottonwoods that shaded the main house, she saw them. Her brother-in-law, Thomas Boyle, stood on the porch, his stout frame blocking the doorway as if he were a boulder that had rolled into place. Beside him, his wife, Eleanor, stood pale and thin, wringing her hands in her apron, her eyes fixed on the dusty toes of her boots. A third man, a stranger in a town suit, leaned against a porch post, holding a leather satchel. Nora felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was not a sympathy call. She dismounted, her limbs stiff and heavy. The mare shook its head, harness jangling in the unsettling quiet. The usual sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of the hands, were absent. A silence had been laid over the property, as thick and suffocating as a wool blanket in summer. "Thomas," Nora said, her voice raspy. She nodded toward his wife, Eleanor. Thomas Boyle did not return the greeting. He had James's eyes, but where her husband's had been filled with a warm, crinkling humor. Thomas's were flat and hard like river stones. "Nora, we were waiting for you." "I can see that. Where are the men the cattle need to be brought in?" "The men have been paid their wages and sent on their way," Thomas said. His tone was final, a door slamming shut. "Their services are no longer required." Nora's gaze flickered from his unmoving face to the stranger, who pushed himself off the post and opened his satchel. "I do not understand. James left everything to me. The ranch, the stock, everything." "That is where you are mistaken," Thomas said. He took a sheaf of papers from the stranger. "James was a good man, but not always a practical one. He took out a significant loan against this property 2 years ago. From me, business was not as good as he let on. He held the papers out. This is the deed. Ownership reverted to me upon his death to settle his debt. It is all legal and binding." Nora stared at the documents. The script was dense, the language a thicket of words she could not penetrate. She saw James's signature at the bottom of one page, but it looked wrong, too hurried, not the careful way he signed his name. "No," she whispered. "He would have told me. We had no secrets." "Apparently, he had this one," Thomas said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "He did it to protect you from worry." The lie was so bald, so shameless. It stole the breath from her lungs. James had been meticulous. He would never have been so foolish, so reckless, and he would never, ever have hidden it from her. "This is a forgery," she said, her voice gaining strength. "This is a lie, Thomas, and you know it." Eleanor flinched, but Thomas's expression did not change. "The law will not see it that way. The county judge has already stamped it. The ranch is mine. Nora, the house, the land, the brand, everything." He took a step forward. "I will not have you destitute. Here is $50. It should be enough to get you to Tucson and find some kind of work. A seamstress, perhaps." He tried to press the coins into her hand. She recoiled as if from a hot iron. "I will not take your stolen money." A flicker of anger crossed his face. "Have it your way, then, but you will leave the premises. Now." He pointed a thick finger toward the road. "I want you gone within the hour." The injustice was a physical thing, a burning pressure behind her eyes. She looked past him at the front door, at the rocker where she and James had spent so many evenings watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. She saw the window box she had planted with geraniums, now wilting from neglect. Everything she had built, everything she had loved, was being ripped from her with a piece of paper and a lie. "My things," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that surprised her. "My personal belongings. My mother's locket. My letters." Thomas gestured dismissively. "Eleanor packed a small trunk for you. It is by the steps." She saw it then. A small, battered trunk that held only a fraction of her life. The finality of it was a blow to the gut. She looked at Eleanor, a desperate, silent appeal. Her sister-in-law finally met her eyes, and in them Nora saw not malice, but a terrible, weak-willed fear. Eleanor knew this was wrong, but she would not speak. She would stand by her husband, a ghost in her own home. "Thomas, please," Nora said, the anger draining away, leaving only a raw desperation. "Just for a few days. Let me think. Let me figure out what to do." "No," he said, and then he did the last, cruelest thing. He reached out and unhooked the ring of iron keys from the belt at her waist, the large, heavy key to the front door, the smaller one for the pantry, the key to the smokehouse. The weight of them, the sound of them, had been a constant, comforting presence. He snatched them away, and the jingle they made as he dropped them into his own pocket was the sound of her life ending. The trunk and the horse, the clothes on your back. That is all. Now go. He turned without another word and went into her house, shutting the door firmly behind him. The stranger tipped his hat with a smirk and followed. Only Eleanor remained for a moment, a silhouette behind the window, before she, too, disappeared into the shadows. Nora stood alone in the swirling dust. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, stinging her cheek like a slap. She looked at the small trunk, then at the long, empty road leading to the town of Jericho. The sun was getting low, bleeding red and orange across the horizon. She had no plan, no money, and no one to turn to. For a long moment, she felt nothing but the crushing weight of her own powerlessness. Then, a different feeling began to smolder in the pit of her stomach. Humiliation. It burned hot and clean, clearing away the fog of grief. Thomas had taken her home, but he would not take her pride. She would not break. She would not give him the satisfaction. With movements that felt both wooden and precise, she lifted the trunk and tied it clumsily behind her saddle. She did not look back at the house again. To look back was to invite despair, and despair was a luxury she could not afford. She mounted the mare and urged her forward, leaving the Double Creek Ranch behind, the swirling dust a fitting curtain on the final act of her life there. The town of Jericho was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, but it had a sheriff. His name was Miller, a man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much to get excited about anything. Nora found him in his office, leaning back in his chair with his boots propped on a desk littered with paperwork. The air smelled of stale coffee and cheap cigars. She explained the situation in a low, steady voice, holding out the single piece of paper Thomas had shoved at her, a supposed notice of eviction. She spoke of the forged signature, of the men being dismissed, of being thrown out of her own home on the day she buried her husband. Sheriff Miller listened without moving a muscle. When she finished, he sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath, and swung his boots to the floor. He took the paper from her and glanced at it, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am," he said, handing it back, "this here document looks official. It has the county stamp." "The judge who stamped it is a cousin of Thomas Boyle's," Nora said, her voice tight. "The signature is not my husband's. I would swear to it on a Bible." "Your word against his," the sheriff said with a shrug. "And Thomas Boyle. He owns the mercantile. He has an interest in the silver claim up north. He is a man of property. The law tends to listen to men of property." "So you will do nothing?" she asked, incredulous. "You will let him steal my home, my livelihood, everything my husband and I worked for?" "There is nothing I can do," Miller said, and for the first time, he looked her in the eye. There was no pity there, only a profound weariness. This is a civil matter, a dispute over a contract. You need a lawyer for that, and lawyers cost money. My job is to keep the peace, not to sort out family squabbles over inheritance. He stood up, a clear dismissal. I am sorry for your loss, ma'am, about your husband. But as for the ranch, my hands are tied. I would advise you to take that $50 your brother-in-law offered and make a fresh start. Nora stared at him, at the badge pinned to his chest that was supposed to represent justice. It was just a piece of tin. The law was not a shield for the innocent. It was a fence built by the rich to protect their own. She turned and walked out of the office, the sheriff's empty words echoing in the silent street. Defeated, she spent what little money she had in her pockets on a piece of bread and some cheese. She ate by the town well, watching the sky darken to a deep, starless indigo. There was a boarding house, but she did not have the money for a room. Her only option was to ride on to the next town, a place called Silver Creek, where she had heard they were hiring laundry workers at the big hotel. It was a 20-mile ride through open country, a ride she would have to make in the dark. She led the mare out of town as the last vestiges of light faded from the sky. The wind picked up, colder now, and it carried the lonesome sound of a coyote's howl. The road was a pale ribbon unwinding into the blackness. The rhythmic clip-clop of the mare's hooves was a lonely sound. Loneliness was a new and terrible country, and she was its sole inhabitant. She pulled her shawl tighter, her thoughts a bitter swirl of what she had lost and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when the mare suddenly shied, pulling hard on the reins and dancing sideways. Nora, lost in her thoughts, was nearly unseated. "Easy, girl," she soothed, patting the horse's trembling neck. "What is it?" She peered into the darkness. The road ahead was flanked by a tumble of large boulders, their shapes barely visible against the night sky. There was no sound but the ceaseless wind. She urged the mare forward, her heart starting to beat a little faster. Then she saw it, a spark of orange in the rocks, the glowing tip of a cigarette, quickly extinguished. Before she could react, a rifle shot cracked through the night. The sound was deafening. A hornet screamed past her ear, and the mare screamed. Too, a sound of pure terror. It reared high, breaking Nora's hold on the reins, and bolted. Nora clung to the saddle horn. Her body slammed back and forth as the horse galloped blindly into the desert. Another shot rang out, and she heard the bullet thud into the trunk behind her. She was going to die. The thought was strangely calm. Thrown from her horse and shot in the dark by some nameless highwayman. The man had not expected the horse to run so fast. He cursed under his breath, stepping out from behind the rocks to take better aim. He was not a random bandit. He had been given a job with specific instructions. Make it look like a robbery, a tragic accident, no witnesses. He lifted the rifle, tracking the fleeing shape. In another moment, he would have a clear shot. He never heard the footsteps behind him. Naiche moved like a shadow. He had been tracking the trail of a heavy wagon for 2 days, a wagon whose tracks told him it was loaded with ammunition heading for the soldiers at Fort Grant. The work was slow, requiring patience and absolute focus. The gunshot had been an unwelcome interruption. A single shot, then another. It was clumsy, not the work of a hunter. He had circled around, silent on his moccasined feet, to investigate. He saw the man with the rifle, aiming at the runaway horse. He saw the faint outline of the woman on its back. He did not know these people or their quarrel, but he recognized the man's intent. This was an execution. Naiche did not hesitate. He closed the final 10 feet in a silent rush. The gunman sensed something at the last second. Turning his head, it was too late. Naiche's arm snaked around the man's throat, cutting off his air. His other hand wrenched the rifle away. The man struggled, his boots kicking up dust, but it was like fighting a force of nature. Naiche was not large, but his strength was like coiled steel. He twisted, and there was a sharp, ugly crack of bone. The man went limp. Naichi let the body fall to the ground. He stood for a moment, listening. The sound of the galloping horse was fading. The woman was in danger. A horse running wild at night in this country would find a ravine or a rock fall soon enough. He slung the captured rifle over his shoulder and broke into a steady, ground-eating trot, following the sound. Nora did not know how long she held on. The mare ran with the wind, its lungs heaving. Finally, its panic began to subside, its wild gallop slowing to a canter, then a nervous trot. It came to a stop in a small clearing, its flanks lathered in sweat, its whole body trembling. Nora slid from the saddle, her own legs so weak they could barely hold her. She leaned against the horse's warm body, gasping for air, her mind a blank slate of shock. A sound made her freeze, the soft scuff of a foot on stone. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure emerged from the darkness. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin leggings and a simple cloth shirt. His black hair was long, held back by a leather band. In one hand, he carried a rifle. He was an Apache. Every story she had ever heard, every whispered warning about renegades and massacres, flooded her mind. She scrambled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She had escaped a gunman only to run straight into the arms of a savage. The man stopped a few feet away. He made no threatening move. He simply watched her, his face unreadable in the dim starlight. "He is gone," the man said. His voice was low and quiet, with an accent she could not place. It held no menace. Who she managed to whisper, "The man who shot at you?" Nora stared at him, confused. "You saw him?" The Apache nodded once. "I stopped him." The meaning of his words slowly sank in. This man had not come to harm her. He had helped her. He had saved her. She looked at the rifle in his hands and realized it was not his. It was a Winchester, like the one Thomas Boyle kept on his mantelpiece. You stopped him," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Is he—" "He will not trouble you again," the man said, his gaze distant. He looked at the ground near her feet and then bent down. He picked something up, something small that had fallen from the gunman's pocket during the struggle. He held it out to her on his open palm. It was a small, ornately carved wooden matchbox. Nora recognized it instantly. It was a custom design that Thomas Boyle had commissioned for himself last Christmas, with his initials, T.B., carved into the lid. The world tilted on its axis. It had not been a highwayman. It had not been a random robbery. Thomas had sent someone to kill her. He was not content with stealing her home. He wanted to erase her completely. The shock of the realization was so profound, she felt a wave of dizziness. She stumbled, and the Apache shot out a hand, his fingers closing around her arm to steady her. His grip was firm, his touch surprisingly warm against her cold skin. She looked up into his face. His eyes were dark and deep, and in them, she saw not the savagery of the stories, but a quiet, assessing intelligence. "Who are you?" she breathed. He released her arm. "My name is Naichi." He stood before her, a man from a world she did not know, who had appeared out of the night and saved her life for reasons she could not fathom. The wind howled around them, swirling the dust at their feet. Nora looked from the matchbox in her hand to the stranger's quiet face, and for the first time since leaving her ranch, she was not entirely alone in the dark. The matchbox felt cold and heavy in her palm, a solid piece of damning proof. Nora's mind reeled, trying to connect the man who had sat at her dinner table, her husband's brother, with the cold-blooded killer who had sent a man to shoot her in the back. The wind seemed to mock her, pulling at her dress and hair as if trying to unravel her completely. Naichi watched her, his expression unreadable, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. He had killed a man to save her, yet he was an Apache, a name that settlers spoke with fear. Her whole body was a battlefield of conflicting instincts, gratitude fought with ingrained terror, shock with a desperate need for survival. He gave her no time to dwell on it. With a slight nod toward the nervous horse, he spoke. "We cannot stay here. Another may come." His logic was undeniable. She tucked the matchbox deep into a pocket of her dress, the sharp corners digging into her hip. She tried to move toward the mare, but her legs were still unsteady. Naichi stepped forward, not offering a hand, but simply taking the reins himself. He led the horse, and she followed on trembling legs, away from the road and into the broken country of canyons and washes. He moved with a certainty that was both unnerving and reassuring. He seemed to read the land in the darkness, his feet finding paths where she saw only a jumble of rocks and thorny brush. After a quarter of an hour, he led them into a narrow slot canyon. The towering red rock walls on either side blocked the wind, and the sudden silence was profound. The air was still and cool. Naichi stopped and finally looked at her, his gaze taking in her torn sleeve and the dark scrape along her cheekbone where she'd been hit by a branch during the horse's panicked flight. "You are hurt," he stated. It was not a question. Before she could reply, he untied a small leather pouch from his belt. He took out a piece of clean cloth and a bladder of water. He poured a small amount onto the cloth and held it out to her. Nora hesitated for only a second. Her fear was a distant thing now. A story someone else had told her. The reality was this man, the quiet canyon, and the sting on her face. She took the damp cloth and pressed it to her cheek, wincing as it cleaned the grit from the wound. He watched her, his head tilted slightly. The white man's law did not help you in town. It was another statement, not a question. He had seen more than she realized. "No," she said, her voice low and bitter. "The law is for men like Thomas Boyle, not for widows with nothing. And you have nothing." "He took it all," she whispered, the cloth still pressed to her face. "My home, my life." She looked at him then, the first direct look she had dared to give, in the faint starlight that filtered into the canyon. His features were sharp, his eyes shadowed. "Why did you help me?" Naichi turned his attention to her arm, gesturing for her to show him the torn sleeve. Reluctantly, she did. A long scratch, deep and bleeding sluggishly, ran from her elbow to her wrist. He took a pinch of a fine, dark powder from his pouch and sprinkled it carefully along the wound. It stung, but the bleeding stopped almost immediately. "I was not helping you," he said, his voice flat as he concentrated on his task. "I was stopping him. There is too much shooting. The soldiers look for any reason to ride, to burn, to kill. One dead man in the desert is a reason. One dead woman is a reason." He met her eyes again. "His foolish noise put my people in danger." His reasoning was cold, practical, and it made more sense than any notion of chivalry. He was not her savior. He was a man protecting his own. The realization should have been disheartening, but instead, it felt honest. In a world that had become a web of lies, his stark honesty was something she could grasp. He finished his work by tearing a strip from the cloth and binding her arm tightly. "Where were you going?" he asked, his hands busy with the knot. "Silver Creek, to find work. The soldiers have patrols on that road. They will find the body by morning. They will stop anyone they see. They will ask questions a woman traveling alone cannot answer." He straightened up, his assessment of her situation complete and bleak. "And if they learn who you are, they will return you to Jericho, to your brother-in-law." The thought sent a chill through her. Thomas would not make the same mistake twice. Next time, he would ensure she disappeared for good. "What am I to do?" she asked. The question pulled from the depths of her despair. Naichi was silent for a long moment, studying her face. He seemed to be weighing something. "There is a woman," he said finally, "Doña Luz. She lives south of here, near the old mission ruins. She owes no love to the soldiers or the men in the towns. You would be safe with her for a time." "Why would you take me there?" "I am tracking a wagon," he said, his gaze turning toward the mouth of the canyon, as if he could see it in the darkness. It carries many rifles, much ammunition, for the fort. If those guns reach the soldiers, a new war will begin. My people want only to live in peace on the land we have been given, but the soldiers will not allow it. They will use those guns. I mean to stop the wagon before it reaches them. Not with blood, but the guns must be taken. He looked back at her. The wagon passed through Jericho. You know these lands. The roads a heavy wagon must take. You will guide me. In return, I will see you safely to the house of Doña Luz. A deal. Not charity. A transaction between two people with nothing left to lose. He needed her knowledge. She needed his protection. It was a strange and desperate alliance. To help an Apache intercept army munitions was treason. But what allegiance did she owe to the laws and the army that had left her to her fate? I know the way, she said, her voice firm. The wagon would have to take the old freighter's road through Granite Pass. It is the only way to cross the mountains with a heavy load. He gave a single, satisfied nod. The bargain was struck. He took the water bladder and offered it to her. Drink. We will rest here until the moon sets. Then we ride. Nora took the bladder. The leather was worn and smooth. She drank deeply, the water cool and clean. When she was finished, she handed it back to him. He drank as well. In the quiet of the canyon, the simple act of sharing water felt like a treaty, a fragile truce signed in the heart of a hostile land. They traveled for the next few hours in silence, Naichi leading the way on foot, a tireless, ghostly figure, and Nora following on the mare. The landscape became harsher, a maze of dry arroyos and skeletal saguaro cacti that reached toward the star-strewn sky like desperate hands. The world felt ancient and indifferent to her small, human grief. All that mattered here was the next step, the next breath, the next sip of water. As the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, they were crossing a wide, sandy wash, the bed of a river that had not seen water in a generation. Naichi suddenly stopped. He held up a hand, and Nora halted the mare. He crouched, examining the ground, then looked to the west. A storm comes, he said. Nora looked in the same direction. The sky was clear, the air still. There are no clouds. You see with your eyes, he said, standing. You must learn to feel with your skin. The air is heavy, the birds are quiet. He pointed to a line of distant mesas. We must reach the shelter of those rocks. Quickly. He broke into a run, and Nora urged the mare into a jarring trot to keep up. Within minutes, she felt it. A change in the pressure of the air. A low, humming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. A line of brown appeared on the horizon, rising like a solid wall. The dust storm was upon them far faster than she could have believed possible. The wind hit first, a physical blow that staggered the horse and tore at Nora's clothes. Then came the dust. It was not like the gentle dust of the ranch. This was a churning, blinding cloud of sand and grit that erased the world. Visibility dropped to nothing. The sun disappeared. The air became thick, hot, and impossible to breathe. The mare whinnied in terror, turning in circles. Naichi's hand shot out of the brown chaos and grabbed the mare's bridle, pulling the animal's head down. "Get off!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Stay with the horse." Nora slid to the ground, pressing her body against the mare's shivering flank. She pulled her shawl over her head. But the sand was insidious, finding its way into her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She could feel its abrasive sting against her skin. The world was a screaming, suffocating nightmare. She was blind, deafened by the storm's fury. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her throat. Then she felt a presence beside her. Naichi had pressed himself against her other side, creating a human and animal wall against the worst of the storm. He had pulled the mare into the slight lee of a large, half-buried boulder she had not even seen. He put a hand on her shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure that cut through her fear. They huddled there, 3 living creatures against the raw power of the land. As the world was scoured clean around them, the storm raged for what felt like an eternity. when it finally began to subside. It did so as quickly as it had arrived. The roar lessened to a moan, then a whisper. The thick brown cloud thinned to a hazy veil. Light returned to the world, a strange, filtered orange light. Nora lowered her shawl. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of red dust. Her throat was raw. Her eyes burned. Naiche was already on his feet, checking the horse, speaking to it in low, soothing tones in his own language. The mare was still trembling but had calmed under his touch. Nora pushed herself up, her joints aching. They had survived. They rested for a while in the eerie, orange twilight of the storm's aftermath, allowing the air to clear. Nora felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but also a strange sense of clarity. The storm had stripped away everything but the essential. Out here, there was no law but survival. Naiche walked over to her. He was holding something in his hand. This was on the ground. He said, near where he fell. He opened his palm. Lying there, nestled in the dust that coated his skin, was a small glass pendant on a thin leather cord. Inside the glass, perfectly preserved, were the delicate, feathery seeds of a dandelion. Nora's breath caught in her throat. James had given it to her on their first anniversary. He had told her it was a pocketful of wishes. She had been wearing it when she went to the funeral. The cord must have broken when the horse bolted. She reached out with a trembling hand and took it from him. The glass was cool against her skin. She had thought it was lost forever. Its return was a small, impossible miracle, but it was also something more. Thomas, or the man he had hired, had placed it there. They had taken it from her, perhaps when she was reeling from the news about the ranch, and left it at the scene. It was meant to be found on her body. A final, sentimental touch to make the story of a tragic robbery more convincing. The cruelty of it, the calculated, meticulous evil was breathtaking. She looked up at Naiche, the pendant clutched in her fist. Her eyes were burning, but not just from the dust. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded, his face giving nothing away, but he had not had to show it to her. He could have thrown it away. Instead, he had carried it through the storm and returned it. He had returned a piece of her past, a piece of her heart. The sun finally broke through the haze, bathing the transformed landscape in a clean, new light. The fragile truce between them had been tested by the storm and had held. Now, looking at the dandelion seeds in her hand, Nora knew it had become something more. It was an alliance, forged in violence and sealed in the shared dust of the Arizona desert. She was no longer just a victim running for her life. She was a survivor, and she was not alone. The journey ended at a place that seemed to cling to the edge of the world. Doña Luz's establishment was not a ranch or a fort, but a long, low adobe building hunkered down in a dip of the terrain. A solitary outpost where the road from the east frayed and disappeared into the vast, sun-bleached expanse of the Mexican territory. A weathered sign, painted in both Spanish and English, announced it as La Posada Sin Nombre, the inn without a name. A few scrawny chickens pecked in the dust of the courtyard, and the sound of a softly played guitar drifted from an open doorway, a fragile melody against the immense silence of the desert. Naiche stopped them a short distance away, his body held in an attitude of listening. Nora felt a profound weariness settle into her bones. Every muscle ached. Her mind was a dull buzz of fear and exhaustion. The trust she had placed in this man was a thin thread, spun from desperation, and she did not know if it would hold. He gave a low whistle, a sound like a mourning dove. A few moments later, a woman appeared in the main doorway. She was not old, but her face was a map of a life lived under the hard sun. Her dark hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple dark skirt and a white blouse, and she wiped her hands on an apron as she peered toward them. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. She saw Naiche and a flicker of recognition, but no surprise crossed her face. Then her gaze moved to Nora, taking in her dusty morning dress, the makeshift bandage on her arm, the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. Naiche led the mare forward. He and the woman exchanged a few words in Spanish, too rapid for Nora to follow. His tone was low and factual. The woman, Doña Luz, listened without interruption, her eyes still on Nora. When he had finished, she finally spoke, her English accented but clear. She asked him if this was his trouble. Naiche looked at Nora, then back at the woman. He replied that it was the trouble of a man named Boyle in Jericho, and that this woman was now a part of it. Doña Luz seemed to consider this. She looked at Nora again, a long, assessing gaze that was neither kind nor unkind. It was the look of a person who had to measure the cost of everything. Finally, she gave a slight nod. She told Nora that she could stay. There was a room. There would be work to earn her keep. She gestured toward the stables. She said the horse would be cared for. But the man, Naiche, could not stay. His presence would bring the wrong kind of attention. Naiche showed no reaction. This was what he had expected. Inside, the inn was cool and dark. The air smelled of burnt coffee, chili, and old wood. A few men sat at tables, speaking in low voices, their faces weathered and brown. They glanced at Nora, their curiosity barely veiled, but said nothing. Doña Luz led her down a short hallway to a small, spare room. It contained a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single wooden chair. A small window, covered by a simple curtain, looked out onto a walled garden where herbs and peppers grew in defiant patches of green. It was the most beautiful room Nora had ever seen. Luz told her there was hot water for washing. A meal would be ready soon. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. Nora stood in the center of the room for a long time, just breathing. She touched the rough quilt on the bed. She ran her hand along the cool adobe wall. She was safe. The feeling was so foreign, so overwhelming. It brought tears to her eyes. She washed the layers of dust and grime from her face and hands, the water turning red-brown in the basin. She looked at her reflection in the small, warped mirror above the stand. A stranger looked back, a woman with haunted eyes and a streak of gray in her hair that had not been there 2 days ago. Later, sitting in the kitchen, she ate a bowl of thick, spicy stew. Doña Luz worked around her, her movements economical and precise. She did not ask questions, and Nora offered no information. The silence was a comfort. That night, as Nora lay in the narrow bed, she heard the soft strains of the guitar again, a lament that spoke of loss and longing. For the first time since James's death, she slept without dreaming out. The next few days passed in a haze of work and quiet recuperation. Nora helped Doña Luz in the kitchen, swept the floors, and tended the small garden. The physical labor was a balm, a way to keep her mind from circling the dark pit of what had happened. She learned the rhythms of the inn, the quiet mornings, the busier evenings when freighters and travelers stopped for a meal and a bed. She saw Naiche once more before he left. He met her by the stables at dawn. He was leaving to find the munitions wagon. He did not say when or if he would be back. He simply looked at her, and then pressed something hard and cool into her hand. It was a knife. The handle was made of smooth, dark wood, and the blade was sharp and clean. He told her that a safe room was not always enough. A woman needed to be able to protect her own safety. Nora's fingers closed around the handle. It felt heavy, a solid weight of responsibility. It was a gift of trust, a sign that he saw her not as a helpless victim, but as a partner in their desperate bargain. She thanked him, her voice barely a whisper. He only nodded, then melted into the pre-dawn shadows and was gone. She hid the knife in the folds of her skirt, a secret strength against her skin. The trouble came on the third day, in the form of a freight driver heading west. He was a loud, beefy man who had come from Jericho, and he was full of news. He sat at the largest table, his voice booming through the common room. He spoke of the sudden death of James Boyle, a good man. And then he spoke of the widow. The story, he said, was that she had gone mad with grief. She had accused her own brother-in-law of theft and then had run off in the middle of the night with a wild Apache buck. She had abandoned her husband's grave and her family to take up with a renegade. Nora stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a stack of plates in her hands. The words were like stones, each one a sharp blow. This was the story Thomas had woven. He had not only stolen her home, he had stolen her name, her reputation. He had painted her as a madwoman and a wanton creature, a story that would justify anything that might happen to her. Doña Luz came and stood beside her. She placed a calm hand on Nora's arm and guided her back into the kitchen, away from the prying eyes and the poisonous words. Luz said that a lie travels fast when it is what people want to believe. The next afternoon, Sheriff Miller rode into the courtyard. He was not alone. He had 2 deputies with him, hard-faced men with rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They dismounted and swaggered into the inn as if they owned it. Miller's eyes scanned the room and found Nora where she stood by the hearth. A smug, satisfied look settled on his face. He told her she was a hard woman to find. He said Thomas Boyle was worried about her. He wanted her to come back to Jericho, where she could be looked after. He made it sound like a kindness, but his eyes were cold and flat. It was a summons, not an invitation. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady when she answered. She told him she was not going back. She said there was nothing for her in Jericho. Miller's mustache twitched in irritation. He took a step closer. He said he was the law, and he was telling her to come. He warned her not to make this difficult. He said people were saying things about her, things that a decent woman would want to put right. Doña Luz moved from behind the counter, holding a heavy iron skillet. She did not raise it, but her presence was a clear message. She told the sheriff that this was her property. The woman was her guest and her employee. She was not breaking any laws. The sheriff had no authority here. One of the deputies shifted his rifle, a subtle threat. He sneered at Nora. He asked if it was true what they said, that she preferred the company of red men now. The insult was meant to shame her, to break her, but Nora looked him straight in the eye. The memory of Naichi's quiet strength, the solid weight of the knife against her thigh, gave her courage. She told the man that she preferred the company of honest men, and that she had not found any in Jericho. The sheriff's face hardened. He was not used to being defied, especially by women. He was about to speak again, to escalate the confrontation, when a man who had been sitting quietly in a corner of the room stood up. He was dressed differently from the other patrons. His clothes were dark and well-made, a city suit that looked out of place in the dusty inn. He was of medium height, with a neat brown beard and watchful, intelligent eyes. He moved with a quiet confidence that made the sheriff and his men seem like clumsy oafs. The man walked toward their group. He did not look at Nora or Luz. He addressed himself only to the sheriff. He introduced himself as Mr. Pike. He said he had some business to discuss with the sheriff, business that might be profitable for him. He suggested they conclude their conversation outside. His voice was polite, almost a whisper, but it carried an authority that Miller immediately recognized and respected. It was the authority of money. Sheriff Miller hesitated, his gaze flicking from Pike to Nora. He was reluctant to leave without his prize. Pike added, his voice still low, that his employer was a very important man who did not appreciate his affairs being handled in a clumsy or public manner. He said the matter of the woman could be resolved more discreetly. That was enough, Miller grunted, a sound of frustrated acquiescence. He shot Nora a final, venomous look, a promise that this was not over. Then he and his deputies turned and followed Mr. Pike out into the glaring sunlight of the courtyard. Nora watched them through the window. She saw Pike speaking to the sheriff in low tones. She saw him take a thick envelope from his coat pocket and press it into Miller's hand. The sheriff's posture changed. He became deferential, nodding his head. The bribe had been paid. The law had been bought. The deputies lounged by their horses, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Thomas Boyle's reach was longer and more powerful than she had ever imagined. After a few minutes, Miller and his men mounted their horses and rode away. Not looking back, Pike remained for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the inn. For a single, chilling second, his eyes met Nora's through the window. There was no emotion in them at all, just a cold, professional assessment. It was the look of a man who saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. Then he, too, turned and walked to his horse, a fine-looking bay, and rode off in the direction of Jericho. Nora let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her legs felt weak. She had won the confrontation, but she knew she had not won the war. She was no longer just fighting her brother-in-law. She was fighting his money, the law he had purchased, and the cold-eyed man in the city suit. That night, sleep would not come. She sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness, the faint sounds of the inn her only company. She drew the knife Nietzsche had given her. She ran her thumb carefully along the flat of the blade. It was a simple tool, but it was real. It was honest. In her world of lies and deceit, it was the only thing she could truly count on. Her home was gone. Her name was ruined. The life she had known was a country she could never return to. There was no road back. There was only the long, dark, and dangerous road ahead. She held the knife tighter, its solid presence a comfort in the lonely dark. She was afraid, but for the first time, she was ready. The days at the inn settled into a fragile routine, but peace was a mirage in a heat shimmer. Every new rider, every strange voice, sent a jolt of anxiety through Nora. She worked, she ate, she slept, but she was living in a cage of her own fear. The story the freight driver had told had spread like a prairie fire, and she could feel the change in the way some of the travelers looked at her. She was a marked woman, a piece of gossip, a fallen dove. The safety of the inn was starting to feel like a prison, and she knew she could not stay hidden forever. News of the world outside came in scraps. A prospector spoke of increased army patrols. A Mexican trader mentioned a band of Apaches who had vanished from the reservation, their tracks leading north. Then, a week after the sheriff's visit, a tired man on a tired horse stopped for water, his face smudged with soot. He had come down from the high country, through Granite Pass. He spoke of finding the remains of a burned-out freight wagon, a bad business. He said, looked like a botched robbery. The attackers had set it ablaze but had not managed to loot it completely. Most of the cargo was destroyed. Army munitions, he reckoned. From the look of the smashed crates, Nora stood wiping down a table, her knuckles white on the rag. Granite Pass, the very route she had told Nietzsche the wagon would take. A cold dread, mingled with a strange and unwelcome hope, washed over her. Nietzsche had said he would stop the wagon, not with blood, but that the guns had to be taken. Had he done this, or was this something else entirely? The possibility that the burned wagon was connected not only to Nietzsche, but also to Thomas Boyle began to take root in her mind. A wagon full of army rifles was a valuable prize. A man who would forge a deed and hire a killer would not shrink from stealing government property. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark, the man's words echoing in her head. She thought of the knife Nietzsche had given her, hidden beneath her mattress. She thought of the dandelion pendant, a constant, fragile weight against her chest. She had been waiting, hiding, reacting. It was not enough. If there was a chance, however slim, that the wreckage of that wagon held proof of Thomas's crimes, she had to see for herself. It was a mad idea, a fool's errand, but staying here, waiting for Pike or the sheriff to return, was a slower, more certain kind of death. Before the first light of dawn, she dressed quietly. She packed a small bag with water, a little food, And the knife. On the kitchen table, she left a simple note for Doña Luz, thanking her for her kindness and saying only that she had gone to find an answer. She saddled the mare, her movements quick and furtive in the gray stillness of the courtyard. As she rode out, she did not look back. The ride to Granite Pass took the better part of a day. The air grew thinner and cooler as she climbed into the high country. The land was beautiful and brutal, a wilderness of pine and rock that was indifferent to her quest. She found the site just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the western peaks. It was a scene of violent destruction. The wagon was a skeleton of blackened timber and twisted iron. The ground was littered with splintered wood and the dark, metallic glint of shell casings. Several of the heavy crates had been busted open, their contents scattered and burned. The air still held the faint, acrid smell of charcoal. She dismounted and walked through the wreckage, her heart pounding. This was his work. She knew it. It was not a robbery. The cargo had been deliberately destroyed, not stolen. Nietzsche had kept his word. He had taken the guns out of the hands of the soldiers. She felt a surge of respect for him, a man who fought his war with fire instead of bullets. She began to search, her eyes scanning every piece of debris. She pushed aside charred planks, her hands becoming black with soot. For a long time, she found nothing. Then, tucked beneath a partially overturned and less damaged crate, she saw it. It was a shipping manifest, a sheaf of papers protected from the worst of the flames. The edges were singed, but the writing in the center was clear. It listed the contents: 100 rifles, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and at the bottom, stenciled in bold black letters, was the point of origin Boyle Mercantile. Jericho. Nora stared at the name, her breath catching in her throat. It was the proof, the absolute, undeniable proof. Thomas was not just stealing from the army. He was supplying them. Or perhaps he was supplying someone else entirely, using an army shipment as a cover. It did not matter. His name was on the paper, linking him to an illegal arms shipment. This was a federal crime, far beyond the reach of a small-town sheriff. This was the key. This could ruin him. She carefully folded the manifest and tucked it inside her dress, against her skin. Her mind raced. She could not go back to the inn. She could not go to Jericho. Her only hope was to take this evidence to the district court in Prescott. It was a long ride, more than 100 miles, through dangerous country. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had more than just a will to survive. She had a weapon. She decided to take a shortcut, a series of canyons that would cut 2 days from the journey. It was a risk, but she felt a desperate urgency. As the mare picked its way down a narrow, winding trail, the canyon walls rose up around her, sheer faces of red rock that seemed to lean in, blocking out the sky. The late afternoon sun beat down, and the heat was like a physical weight. The only sound was the clatter of the mare's hooves on the loose rock. The silence began to feel oppressive, watchful. She came to a place where the canyon forked. One path was wider, the other a narrow slit, barely wide enough for a horse. She chose the narrower way. A mistake. After 100 yards, the canyon walls closed in, and she found herself in a box canyon. It ended in a sheer, unclimbable rock face, a dead end. A cold prickle of unease ran down her spine. As she turned the mare around, a single rifle shot cracked through the stillness. The bullet did not come near her. It slammed into the rock wall just above the narrow entrance she had come through, showering the ground with stone chips. She was trapped. A voice, high and familiar, echoed off the canyon walls. "Well, look at that. The little widow walked right into the parlor." A man stepped into view, blocking the entrance. He held a rifle. He was young, with the same dark hair as James and Thomas, but with a weak chin and shifty eyes. It was Whit Boyle, the youngest of the 3 brothers, the one everyone dismissed as harmless, the one who had always looked at her with a sad, puppy dog expression. There was no sadness in his eyes now. They were hard and bright with a cruel excitement. Whit Nora breathed, her voice a dry rasp. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning up a family mess." "Nora," he said, his voice laced with a newfound arrogance, "Thomas is a planner, but he is not always neat. He sent a fool to do a job, and that fool failed. So he sent me. I am much neater." "Thomas sent you." The betrayal was a fresh wound. Whit had wept at James's funeral, his arm around her shoulders. "He pays well," Whit said with a shrug. "Better than mucking out stables. Now, I hear you have been asking questions, finding things that do not concern you. I am going to need you to give me what you found at the wagon." So they knew. They had been watching her. The man at the inn, Pike, must have arranged it. Her blood ran cold. She was not just cornered. She had been herded into this trap like a sheep to the slaughter. She thought of the knife. It was a pathetic weapon against a rifle, but it was all she had. Then she remembered the rifle Naichi had taken from the first gunman, still in its scabbard on her saddle. "It is over, Nora," Whit said, taking a step forward. "Give me the papers, and I will make this quick. I promise." Suddenly, from the rim of the canyon high above them, a rock clattered down. Whit's head snapped up, his rifle swinging in that direction. "Who is there?" he yelled, his voice tight with alarm. There was no answer but the wind. But in that moment of distraction, Nora saw a flicker of movement on the opposite rim, a shadow detaching itself from the rocks. It was Naichi. He had come back. He had followed her. He had seen the trap. His voice, calm and clear, carried down into the canyon. "Let the woman go." Whit spun around, searching for the source of the voice. "Apache," he spat. "So the stories are true. You are with him." He fired a shot toward the canyon rim where Naichi had spoken, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet whined off the rock, yards from its target. Naichi did not return fire. A second rock tumbled down, this time closer to Whit, making him jump back. It was a game of nerves, a battle of wits. Naichi was drawing his attention, trying to create an opening. Whit was panicked now, his arrogance gone. He was trapped between Nora in the canyon and the unseen enemy above. He made a decision. He would eliminate one threat. He turned his rifle back toward Nora. "This is your fault, you witch!" he screamed, his face contorted. He was raising the rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger, when another shadow moved. It was Naichi. He had used the distraction to move along the rim, and now he launched himself downward, sliding down a steep scree slope in a cascade of rock and dust. Trying to close the distance, it was a desperate, courageous move, but it left him exposed. For a split second, Whit had a clear shot. He swung the rifle, forgetting Nora, all his attention on the Apache warrior scrambling down the slope. Time seemed to slow down. Nora saw it all with a terrible clarity, Whit taking aim. Naichi's defenseless position, the certainty of death in the next heartbeat. Without thinking, she pulled the rifle from its scabbard. Her hands were shaking. She had never fired a weapon like this in her life. She raised it to her shoulder, the metal heavy and awkward. She could not hope to hit Whit from this distance. Not with her lack of skill, but she did not have to. She aimed not at him, but at the rock wall a few feet to his right. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard, slamming into her shoulder and sending a shock of pain through her arm. The explosion was immense. The bullet hit the canyon wall, and a spider web of cracks appeared in the rock. A shower of sharp, stinging fragments erupted outwards. Whit cried out, not in pain, but in shock and surprise, throwing an arm up to shield his face from the rock splinters. The shot broke his concentration, spoiled his aim. He staggered back a step. It was the only opening Naichi needed. He landed at the bottom of the slope, rolling to his feet. In 2 strides, he was on Whit, a living whirlwind of buckskin and fury. He did not use a weapon. He simply slammed into the younger man, and the rifle went flying. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Nora scrambled off the mare, her own rifle held ready, her heart hammering. The fight was short and brutal. Naichi was a warrior. Whit was a bully. Within seconds, it was over. Naichi was on his feet, and Wit was lying on the ground, conscious but gasping for air, the fight knocked out of him. Naichi retrieved Wit's rifle and his own. He came to stand before Nora. His face was grim, his chest rising and falling from the exertion. He looked at her, then at the rifle in her hands. He had seen what she had done. He had seen her save his life. He did not speak. He did not have to. In the tense, ringing silence of the canyon, a new understanding passed between them. He had come back for her, breaking his own rule about not getting involved. And she, in turn, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. They were no longer a man helping a desperate woman. They were partners. They were allies. They were survivors, bound together by the shared echo of a gunshot in a lonely canyon. They left Wit Boyle tied securely, with enough water to last him a day. Naichi said that a passing patrol or a prospector would find him. He would tell a story, but it would be the frantic tale of a failed ambush, and no one would be sure what to believe. Their more immediate problem was that Wit's presence meant Thomas Boyle's men were actively hunting for her, and the canyons were no longer safe. There was only one place Naichi knew where she could disappear completely, a place no white man would ever think to look. He led her away from the established trails, into a part of the country that looked to Nora like an impassable wilderness. For 2 days, they traveled through a landscape of stark and stunning beauty, a land of sculpted red rock and endless sky. Naichi moved through it as if it were his own home, which she was beginning to understand. He taught her to find water, to read the signs of the animals, to listen to the language of the wind. She was a clumsy student, but a willing one. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a profound and humbling respect for the world around her, and for the man who moved through it with such grace. The camp was hidden in a shallow basin, sheltered by a ring of low mesas. It was not a large settlement, perhaps 24 hide lodges, or taipes, set in a wide circle. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Children played in the dust, their laughter a sound Nora had not realized how much she had missed. As they rode in, a hush fell over the camp. Faces turned toward them, dark eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and deep suspicion. A white woman in a torn and dirty mourning dress, riding beside one of their own warriors, was a sight that defied all explanation. Naichi did not take her to a lodge of his own. Instead, he led her to the center of the camp, where an old man sat before a small, smokeless fire. His face was a testament to 100 years of sun and wind, a landscape of wrinkles that held a serene and unshakable wisdom. This, Naichi said in a low voice, was Sani, an elder who held the stories of their people. Sani did not rise. He watched Nora approach, his eyes seeming to look right through her, to the very core of her spirit. Naichi spoke to him in the Apache language, his voice soft but firm. He told the old man what had happened. He spoke of the ambush, of the stolen land, of the burning wagon. He spoke of the shots she had fired to save his life. When he finished, a deep silence settled over the small group that had gathered to listen. Sani finally looked at Nora and spoke in slow, careful English. He said that the world sought to live in balance. A good life, a life of beauty and harmony, was a life lived on a straight path. He said that her path had been broken, thrown into chaos by greed and violence. He asked her if she sought to continue on the path of violence, or if she sought to find her balance again. Nora, standing before this quiet, powerful man, felt the foolishness of her own plans for revenge. She thought of the shipping manifest tucked inside her dress. It was a document of the white man's world, a world of courts and lawyers and purchased justice. Here, in this place, it meant nothing. She met the old man's gaze and spoke the truth. She said she did not know what path she was on, but she knew she could not walk it alone. She sought only a safe place to stand, to find her breath again. Sani nodded slowly, as if this were the answer he had been expecting. He said she could stay. For a time, she would be given shelter. but she would have to earn her place. The people had little, and everyone had to contribute to the whole. Her first test came that very evening. A young man had been brought in. Injured during a hunt, a fall from his horse had resulted in a long, ugly gash on his leg, and the wound was beginning to fester. The camp's healer, a stern, wiry woman named Dasin, was trying to clean it with a poultice of herbs, but the man was feverish, and the area around the cut was red and swollen. Nora watched from the doorway of the lodge where she had been given a space to sleep. She saw Dasin call for hot water, but the water was brought in a clay pot, and the cloths she used were not clean. Nora knew, from her own limited experience nursing James through a bout of lung fever, that this was not enough. The doctor in Jericho had been insistent on one thing: a wound must be kept clean, and the best way to do that was with boiling water and clean cloth. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. She spoke quietly to Naichi, who translated for her. She told Dasin that she knew a way to help fight the fever spirit that had entered the wound. Dasin looked at her with open skepticism, but the young man's condition was worsening, and she was willing to listen. Nora instructed them to bring the water to a hard boil in a metal pot, and to keep it boiling. She asked for the cleanest cloth they could find and dropped it into the pot, letting it boil for several minutes. The people watched, murmuring among themselves, as she used 2 sticks to lift the steaming cloth from the water. When it had cooled just enough to handle, she began to clean the wound, starting from the center and wiping outward, never using the same part of the cloth twice. She washed her own hands meticulously before and after. She showed Dasin how to do it, for hours. They worked together, the old Apache woman and the white widow, applying fresh, boiled cloths to draw out the heat and the sickness. By morning, the fever had broken, and the angry redness around the wound had begun to fade. Dasin did not thank her with words, but the next day, she came to Nora and silently handed her a bracelet of beaten silver, etched with the image of a soaring eagle. It was, Naichi explained, a token of protection, a sign that she was now under the healer's care. Nora had earned a small measure of belonging, not with words, but with her hands. Not everyone was pleased. A warrior named Taza, a man with a hard, unforgiving face and eyes that burned with old anger, confronted Naichi in the center of the camp. He spoke loudly, for all to hear. He said that Naichi had brought a sickness among them, a white woman who would bring nothing but soldiers and death. He reminded them of past betrayals, of treaties broken, of the endless greed of the white man. He said that her fight was not their fight, and that by sheltering her, Naichi was putting all their lives in danger. Naichi stood his ground, his face a calm mask. When Taza had finished, he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the circle. He said that he did not see a white woman. He saw a woman of courage, a woman who had been wronged by her own people and left for dead. He said that she had saved his life, and that the debt of honor was sacred. To turn her away now, he argued, would be to break their own code, to become as heartless as the men who hunted her. He said that the real enemy was not this woman, but the man named Boyle, whose greed was a poison that would eventually spill out and touch them all. The debate was fierce, dividing the small community, but Sani, the elder, had the final word. He rose and walked to the fire. He looked at Nora. He said that when a stranger comes to your door, you can see them as a threat, or you can see them as a test of your strength, your compassion, your wisdom. He said that Nora would stay. She had shown them a skill that was valuable. She had shown them a spirit that was not broken. Taza was not happy, but he accepted the elder's judgment. A fragile peace was restored. As Nora watched the smoke from Sani's fire rise in a straight, unbroken line into the clear desert sky, she felt a sense of peace she had not known was possible. A few days later, Naichi returned from a long scouting ride. He had traveled south, close to the border, and he had stopped at the inn without a name. He brought news from Doña Luz. The older woman, worried about Nora, had sent a message to a trusted friend in Prescott. a retired lawyer who sometimes handled her affairs. She had asked him to look into the deed for the Double Creek Ranch. The lawyer had found something interesting. The original land grant for the ranch had been issued not just to James Boyle, but jointly to him and his father, Seamus Boyle. According to the law, for the property to be sold or transferred, both men would have had to sign the deed. Seamus Boyle had passed away 3 years ago. Naichi relayed the message in his quiet, deliberate way. Thomas Boyle's forged document had James's signature, or a forgery of it, but it was missing the second, crucial signature. Thomas, in his arrogant haste, had overlooked the most important detail of all. He did not have a legal claim to the ranch. He never had. And then Naichi delivered the final, stunning piece of news. Doña Luz had in her possession a certified copy of the original land grant, the one bearing both names, which she had obtained from the land office years ago as a favor for James. She had kept it all this time, a forgotten piece of paper in a dusty lockbox. It was the one document that could prove Thomas Boyle's claim was a fraud. Nora stood in the heart of the Apache camp, the silver eagle bracelet cool against her skin, and listened as the world shifted on its axis once again. The paper she had risked her life for, the shipping manifest, was a weapon against Thomas. But this was a key. It was the key that could unlock her past and give her back her future. Her fight was not just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, and the path to that justice, she now realized, did not lead back to the world she had lost, but forward, with the unlikely allies she had found in the heart of the wilderness. The discovery of the original land grant document changed everything and nothing. It was a piece of paper, a powerful tool in a world Nora was no longer sure she wanted to rejoin. For now, it was a secret she and Naichi shared, a promise of a future battle to be fought on her terms, not Thomas Boyle's. In the meantime, life in the Apache camp continued, a rhythm of survival and community that was both strange and deeply comforting. Nora found her place, not as a guest, but as a contributor. She worked with Dazin, learning the healing properties of desert plants. She helped the women grind corn and mend clothing. She was learning to see the world through their eyes, a world where a person's worth was measured not by what they owned, but by what they gave. The army patrols became more frequent, a constant, menacing presence on the horizon. One afternoon, a scout brought word that a column of soldiers was moving in a wide sweep through the foothills, searching for the very band of Apaches that had given her shelter. They were not on a direct path to the camp, but they were driving the deer and other game before them, and they had cut off access to a vital spring. Sani decided that the women, children, and the elderly needed to move to a safer, more hidden location higher in the mesas until the soldiers passed. It was Naichi's responsibility to guide a small group of them, and he asked Nora to come. Her skills with basic medicine were now respected, and her presence was a comfort to the children, who had grown used to the quiet woman with the sad eyes. They traveled light and fast, a silent procession through the broken land. Naichi led them on a path that was invisible to Nora's eyes, a trail of subtle signs and ancient knowledge. He was a different man out here, not just a warrior, but a shepherd, a protector. He was gentle with the children, patient with the old ones, his quiet confidence a shield for them all. They had reached the new, safe location by late afternoon and were helping the others settle in when the sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue for weeks, began to darken. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an electric tension. The first rains of the season were coming. Naichi, seeing the storm gathering with alarming speed, knew they could not make it back to the main camp before it broke. He found Nora, who was helping an old woman secure a hide shelter, and told her they had to find cover. He led her to a shallow overhang on the side of the mesa, a wide, hollowed-out space in the rock that offered protection from the wind and rain. They reached it just as the first fat drops of water began to fall, staining the red dust dark. Within minutes, the drops became a torrent, a solid sheet of water that blurred the landscape and filled the air with a rushing, drumming sound. A flash of lightning illuminated the valley below, followed by a low, distant rumble of thunder. Naichi built a small, smokeless fire just inside the mouth of the alcove. The flames licked at the dry wood, a small circle of warmth and light against the growing chill. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the rain, two small figures in a vast, storm-washed world. The rain was a cleansing thing, washing the dust from the air, from the rocks, from their own weary souls. Nora pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, a shiver running through her that was not entirely from the cold. Naichi noticed. He rose and went to the small pack he carried. He took out a blanket, woven from dark wool with a simple pattern of red and black lines. He unfolded it and draped it gently over her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, and it smelled of wood smoke and something else, something clean and wild, like the desert after a storm. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. He sat down beside her again, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. They were not touching, but she was intensely aware of his presence, a solid, calming certainty in the wildness of the storm. "The soldiers will not find anyone in this," he said, his gaze on the curtain of rain. "The water washes away all tracks. For tonight, everyone is safe." "You are good with them," Nora said quietly. "The children, the old ones. You lead them with such care." A shadow passed over his face. "I had a brother," he said, his voice low. "He was younger than me. He had a wife, a small son. He did not want to fight. He wanted only to plant his corn and raise his family." He paused, his eyes fixed on a memory only he could see. "The soldiers came. They said some of their cattle had been stolen. It was a lie, an excuse. There was a skirmish. My brother was trying to get his wife and son to safety. He was shot. He was not a warrior. He did not even have a weapon." The simple, unadorned story was more powerful than any tale of battle. Nora could feel the raw edge of his grief, a wound that had never fully healed. It was the same hollow ache that she carried in her own chest. "I am so sorry, Naichi," she whispered. He was silent for a long moment. "That is why I destroyed the wagon," he said, finally looking at her. "More guns will not bring peace. They only create more sorrow. More women without husbands, more sons without fathers." Nora thought of her own loss, not in the violence of a skirmish, but in the quiet, suffocating greed of a parlor room. "My husband, James," she began, her voice thick. "He was a good man. He was kind. He believed in the law. He believed his own family would honor his memory." She looked down at her hands, clenched in her lap. His brother, Thomas, used that goodness against him. He used the law to steal our home, the one we'd built together. It was not just the land, the cattle. It was the place where we were happy, the place where I thought I would grow old. She felt a tear escape and trace a path down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. Here, in the shelter of the rock with this man who had seen so much of her pain, there was no need for pretense. Naichi reached out, not to touch her face, but to gently take her hand. His fingers were strong and warm, his palm calloused from a life of hard work and struggle. He did not say anything. He simply held her hand, a gesture of shared understanding that went deeper than words. They sat like that as the thunder rolled closer and the fire cast flickering shadows on the stone wall behind them. The storm was directly overhead now, the rain a deafening roar. In the enclosed space, it felt as if they were the only two people left in the world. Naichi turned to her, his dark eyes serious in the firelight. He had learned her language, but he still used it with a careful, deliberate simplicity that made every word count. "I have watched you," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the sound of the storm. "I have seen your spirit. It is not broken. It is strong, like a river that finds a new path when the old one is blocked." He looked at their joined hands. "Your world has hurt you. It has taken everything from you." He looked up and met her eyes. And what she saw there was a raw, aching sincerity that stole her breath. "Left penniless by your late husband's kin," he said, the words formal, as if he were reciting a sacred vow. "I offer you my home and my heart." The world seemed to stop. The roar of the rain, the rumble of thunder, the crackle of the fire. It all faded away. There was only his voice, his eyes, and his incredible, impossible offer. My home and my heart. It was not just a proposal of shelter. It was an offering of a new life, a new belonging. Nora's mind reeled. Her first instinct was fear. Fear of what this meant, of what the world would say. A white woman living with an Apache warrior. She would be an outcast from her own people forever. And a deeper fear. The fear of trusting again, of placing her future, her very self, in the hands of another, only to have it crushed. Thomas and Whit had taught her the terrible price of misplaced trust. But then she looked at Nietzsche. She saw the man who had saved her from a killer, the man who had tended her wounds, who had shared his water with her, who had faced down a dust storm at her side, the man who had respected her, who had armed her, who had returned to save her in the canyon. He had shown her, not with words, but with 100 small and large actions, the quality of his heart. This was not an act of pity. It was a proposal made between equals, between two survivors who had seen the darkness in the world and had chosen not to be consumed by it. To accept was a risk, a leap into a future she could not imagine. But to refuse, to cling to the broken pieces of her old life, was to remain a ghost forever. She had been running from a life that was no longer hers. Now, she could choose to run towards something new. This was not about owing him a debt. This was her choice, her own. She leaned forward and gently rested her head against his shoulder. It was a gesture of profound trust and surrender. He did not move, but she felt his arm come around her, pulling the woven blanket tighter, enclosing them both in its warmth. His home. "Yes," she whispered into the rough fabric of his shirt. "Yes." They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the heart of the storm pass over them and move on. Later, when the rain had softened to a gentle drumming and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Nora stirred. She reached into the small satchel she always carried. From it, she took a small, leather-bound journal and a pencil, two of the few possessions she had managed to save from her old life by the faint, flickering light. She opened it to a clean page. Her hand was steady, in her neat, careful script. She wrote down the words he had spoken, the promise that had changed her life. "I offer you my home and my heart." The black graphite stood out stark and clear on the pale paper. A new deed, a new contract, the beginning of a story she would write for herself. The promise made in the heart of the storm settled into a quiet certainty between them. It was a foundation stone laid in a wild and uncertain land, but the world outside their sheltered existence had not been idle. Whit Boyle, found dehydrated and half-mad by a patrol, had told his story. It was a masterful lie, crafted by the cold mind of Agent Pike. In his telling, the savage Apache Nietzsche, in league with the crazed widow Nora Boyle, had ambushed him, stolen his property, and fled. The narrative of a grieving woman gone rogue had been replaced by something far more inflammatory, a white woman kidnapped by a renegade, a story guaranteed to ignite fear and hatred. Soon, posters appeared in every town and settlement from Jericho to the border. They bore Nietzsche's name and a crude, menacing sketch of an Apache warrior. He was wanted for kidnapping, assault, and theft. A substantial reward was offered, enough to turn honest men into hunters and hunters into jackals. Sheriff Miller and Agent Pike had successfully turned Nora's plight into a public crusade, a righteous manhunt that masked the greed and murder at its core. News of the warrant reached the Apache camp through their own silent channels of information. The tension was immediate. Taza and his followers saw it as the fulfillment of their fears. The white woman had brought the entire weight of the white man's law down upon them. Sani, the elder, urged calm, but even he could not deny the gravity of the danger. Nora saw the fear in the eyes of the women she had worked beside. She was no longer just a person. She was a liability, a lightning rod drawing a storm to their doorstep. She could not stay. To remain was to endanger the very people who had shown her a kindness she thought no longer existed in the world. She and Naichi spoke of it by the fire, their voices low as the camp slept around them. Her plan to go to Prescott with the evidence was now impossible. Every road would be watched, but Naichi had an alternative. A yearly trade market was to be held in 2 days, a sprawling, chaotic gathering in a neutral valley near the Mexican line. It was a place where Mexicans, Americans, prospectors, and even some of the more peaceful native tribes came to trade. Crucially, a United States Marshal, a man known to be fair and not easily bought, was scheduled to be in attendance to oversee the proceedings. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. To walk into a crowd of armed men when there was a bounty on Naichi's head was madness. But it was their only chance to bring the evidence to light before an impartial authority. They left the camp at dawn, leaving a promise with Sani that they would draw the trouble away from his people. Their journey was tense, a constant state of high alert. As they approached the valley of the market, the distant sounds of music and the hum of a large crowd reached them. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Hundreds of people swarmed among tents and makeshift stalls. The air was thick with the smells of cooking food, sweat, and livestock. Spanish and English mingled in a constant, noisy babble. Nora felt 1,000 eyes on them as they dismounted. She had traded her black morning dress for a simple brown skirt and blouse provided by the Apache women. But she could not disguise what she was. A white woman with an Apache warrior. The whispers started immediately. A ripple of speculation and condemnation spreading through the crowd. Men stared openly, their hands drifting to the pistols at their belts as they recognized Naichi from the posters. They found the marshal near the center of the market, a tall, graying man with a weary face and a star pinned to his vest. He was listening to a dispute between 2 miners. Sheriff Miller and Agent Pike were standing nearby, speaking with a group of ranchers. Pike saw them first. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. He nudged the sheriff, and they began to walk toward them, their movements confident and predatory. The crowd sensed the impending confrontation and began to form a wide, silent circle around them. "Well now, I told Marshal," Sheriff Miller said, his voice loud for all to hear. "Looks like our work is done for us. Here is the renegade Naichi, and he has got the poor widow Boyle with him." He looked at Nora, his face a mask of false sympathy. "Ma'am, you are safe now. We will take you away from this savage." This was the moment. Nora's heart was a wild drum against her ribs, but her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. She stepped forward, putting herself between Naichi and the lawmen. "I am not in any danger from this man. Sheriff, I am with him by my own choice." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the story they had heard. "The woman is confused," Pike said smoothly, his voice calm and reasonable. "She has been through a terrible ordeal. She does not know what she is saying. I know exactly what I am saying." "Mr. Pike," Nora retorted, her gaze locking with his, "I know that my husband's brother, Thomas Boyle, is a thief and a murderer. I know that he hired a man to kill me, and when that failed, he sent his own brother, Whit, to finish the job." She reached inside her blouse and pulled out the 2 folded documents, the singed shipping manifest, and a carefully made copy of the original land grant that Doña Luz had provided. "And I know," she said, her voice rising, ringing with a conviction that made people listen, "that this so-called deed to my ranch is a forgery, and this shipping manifest proves that Thomas Boyle is engaged in illegal arms trafficking." She held the papers out, not to the sheriff, but to the United States Marshal. "I ask you, sir, as a representative of federal law, to examine this evidence." The marshal, his face grim, stepped forward and took the papers. Sheriff Miller began to bluster, shouting that the papers were meaningless, that the woman was hysterical. But the marshal ignored him, his eyes scanning the documents. The crowd was silent now, caught up in the raw drama unfolding before them. Pike knew he was losing control. The narrative he had so carefully constructed was unraveling. He needed a new tactic, a new source of leverage. He gave a subtle, almost invisible signal to two men who had been lingering at the edge of the crowd. They were his men, hired guns who had been waiting for his command. They began to move, not toward Nora, but toward a small stall where an old woman was selling herbs and remedies. It was Doña Luz. She had come to the market, both to trade and to offer her silent, steadfast support to Nora. The marshal looked up from the papers, his eyes hard as flint. He looked at Sheriff Miller. This manifest has the name Boyle on it, and this land grant copy seems to be in order. These are serious allegations. They will have to be investigated. He stamped the papers with a small, official seal from his pocket, marking them as evidence. The sound of the metal on the paper was a small, sharp crack of hope. At that exact moment, Pike's men reached Doña Luz. One of them grabbed her from behind, clamping a hand over her mouth. The other pressed the barrel of a pistol to her head. "That is enough talk of investigations," Pike called out, his voice sharp and cold. The crowd gasped. "Marshal, you will hand over those papers and the Apache. You will let us pass. If you do not, this old woman will pay the price for your interference." The situation had turned in a heartbeat. The moral victory Nora had won was now meaningless in the face of a pistol barrel. The marshal's hands were tied. He could not risk the life of an innocent woman. Nietzsche took a step forward, his body tense as a drawn bowstring, but he was too far away, and the crowd was in the way. It was then that a new voice cut through the tension. "Let the old one go." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, and it belonged to Taza. He was not alone. Behind him stood a dozen Apache warriors, their faces grim, their hands holding not rifles, but bows. They had not abandoned Nietzsche. They had followed, keeping to the ridges, watching. Taza had argued against sheltering Nora, but he was a man of honor. To see the white man's law resort to taking an old woman hostage was a line he would not allow to be crossed. This was no longer about Nora. This was a violation of the code of the desert, a cowardice that he could not abide. The crowd scrambled back, clearing a wide space. It was a standoff. The sheriff and his men, Pike and his hired guns, against a silent line of Apache archers. The air crackled with the promise of violence. Unknown to them all, another betrayal was already in motion, miles away. In a dusty office in Jericho, Whit Boyle was making a deal. He had been brought back in disgrace, a failure in his brother's eyes. Pike, seeing his weakness, had offered him a choice: a long prison sentence for his part in the ambush, or his freedom in exchange for one piece of information: the location of the Apache camp. Pike wanted to hit the hornet's nest, to wipe out the very people who gave Nietzsche his strength. Whit, a coward to his core, did not hesitate. He agreed to lead them. But as he looked at the map, at the unforgiving maze of canyons and mesas, a cunning, desperate plan formed in his mind. He would not lead them to Sani's camp. He would lead them to a different place, a network of canyons known to the Apaches as the place of no return, a labyrinth from which there was no easy escape. He would save his own skin and, in the process, send his brother's hired army on a fool's errand, giving Nietzsche and Nora the one thing they needed most: time. He pointed a trembling finger to a spot on the map, and the final, fatal piece of Thomas Boyle's plan was set in motion, not by his enemies, but by the weakness of his own blood. The standoff at the trade market broke not with a bang, but with a cold, calculated retreat. Faced with a dozen Apache arrows and the unwavering stare of a United States Marshal, Agent Pike knew a public bloodbath would serve no one, least of all his employers. With a curt nod, his men dragged Doña Luz back, using her as a shield as they withdrew. A message was sent back via a terrified prospector an hour later. The terms were simple: an exchange. The evidence Nora held for the life of Doña Luz. The meeting point was a place called Dry Bone Pass, a notorious bottleneck canyon, to take place at midnight the following day. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. They made their plans in the quiet twilight, a council of war between three disparate worlds. Naichi, the warrior who knew the land as if it were the back of his own hand. Taza, the fierce traditionalist, his animosity toward Nora now replaced by a grim respect and a deeper hatred for the cowardice of men who hide behind female hostages. And Nora herself, no longer a victim, but a strategist, her mind sharp and clear. Taza and his archers would take the high ground, silent hunters in the darkness. To neutralize Pike's sentries, Naichi would create a diversion, a direct and noisy assault on the far side of their camp to draw the bulk of the gunmen's attention. This would leave the center, where Luce would likely be held, exposed for a few critical moments. The most dangerous task, the one requiring stealth and precision, fell to Nora. She was the one they would least expect, the one they still saw as a frightened widow. Dry Bone Pass at night was a place of profound menace. The wind that funneled through the narrow canyon was hot and dry, carrying the scent of distant rain that would never fall here. The sky was a churning mass of dark clouds, and every few minutes a silent, flickering web of lightning would illuminate the stark rock walls, revealing a landscape that looked like the bones of some long-dead creature. Pike had chosen his ground well. He had a clear field of fire, and only one way in or out. The signal was a perfect imitation of a screech owl's cry, a sound that Naichi made from the darkness. A moment later, a flaming arrow arced through the night and slammed into a supply wagon on the far side of Pike's camp. It caught instantly, the dry canvas erupting in a whoosh of orange flame. Shouts of alarm and confusion rang out. As Pike's men rushed toward the fire, Naichi let out a raw, terrifying war cry from the opposite direction, firing his rifle to add to the chaos. The diversion had begun. From the canyon rim, silent arrows began to find their marks. Taza's men worked with deadly efficiency, eliminating the guards Pike had posted on the high ground. The camp was now a whirlwind of gunfire and shadows, exactly as they had planned. Nora moved in the darkness, a ghost in the chaos. She had the knife Naichi had given her tucked into her belt, its solid weight a comfort. She moved not with the grace of an Apache, but with the quiet determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She found the tent Pike was using as his command post, a larger structure set back from the main fire. A single guard stood outside, his attention fixed on the firefight. She circled around, slit the back of the tent with her knife, and slipped inside. Doña Luz was there, tied to a chair, a gag in her mouth, and standing over her, holding a lantern, was Thomas Boyle. He looked haggard, his fine suit stained with dust and sweat, his face pale with a mixture of fear and rage. He had not expected to be on the front lines of his own dirty war. He saw Nora, and for a second, his face registered pure shock. Then it twisted into a mask of fury. "You!" he hissed. "You have ruined everything." "It was ruined the day you decided your greed was worth more than my husband's life," Nora said, her voice low and cold. She held the knife out, not like a brawler, but like a surgeon, the point steady. Thomas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That milksop brother of mine, he never knew how to take what was his. This land, this ranch, it should have been mine from the start." He took a step toward her, his bulk filling the small tent. "Give me the papers, Nora, give them to me, and I will let you and the old woman walk away." "There is no walking away from this." "Thomas," she said. She knew he was lying. He would never let them live. She feinted with the knife, and as he flinched back, she kicked over the lantern. The tent was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering, chaotic light from the burning wagon outside. In the confusion, she lunged forward, not at Thomas but toward Doña Luz. She sliced through the ropes that bound the older woman's hands and pulled the gag from her mouth. Thomas bellowed in rage, fumbling in the dark. Just as he located them, a new sound began, a sound that dwarfed the gunshots and the crackle of the fire. It was a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, growing louder with every passing second. Nora and Luz scrambled out of the back of the tent, The scene outside was apocalyptic. A wall of black, churning water and red mud, 6 feet high, was roaring down the narrow pass. The distant storm had broken over the high plains, and all that water was now being funneled into this single, deadly channel. Men were screaming, horses were rearing in terror. The flash flood was a force of nature, an impartial, unstoppable judge. It hit the camp with the force of a battering ram, sweeping away tents, wagons, and men as if they were nothing more than children's toys. Nora saw Naichi near the edge of the torrent, trying to pull a trapped warrior to safety. The ground beneath him, already saturated, gave way. He slipped, his feet sliding out from under him, and he began to slide toward the churning maelstrom of mud and debris. There was no time to think. Nora saw a coil of rope on the saddle of a nearby, panicked horse. She grabbed it, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She ran to the edge of the collapsing bank, braced herself, and threw the rope with all her strength. It fell short. The mud was sucking at Naichi's legs, pulling him down. "Naichi," she screamed over the roar of the flood. He looked up, his face grim. He was losing his fight. She recoiled the rope, her movements frantic. She threw it again. This time, the loop at the end landed just within his reach. He grabbed it, his grip like iron. Nora dug her heels into the soft earth, the rope burning her hands as it went taut. For a heart-stopping moment, it was a battle of her strength against the power of the flood. Then she felt another pair of hands on the rope beside her. Taza. He had seen what was happening and had come to help. Together, they pulled, straining with every muscle, and dragged Naichi from the edge of the abyss, up onto solid ground. The main force of the flood passed in less than a minute, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. In the sudden ringing silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the gurgle of the receding mud, they looked at what was left. Thomas Boyle, caught in the open as he ran from the tent, was gone. Claimed by the red mud he had, in a way, summoned with his own deceit. Agent Pike was alive. They found him pinned beneath a dead horse, his leg broken, his face a mask of disbelief. He was a man whose meticulous plans had been obliterated by something he could never control. Taza's men rounded up the few remaining survivors of Pike's small army. They found Whit Boyle cowering behind a boulder, soaked and shivering. He had been brought along to ensure he did not talk, and now he was all that was left of the Boyle ambition. As Taza's men tied his hands, he began to babble, his mind broken by the night's terror. He spoke of a secret ledger, a small, oilskin-wrapped book that Pike never let out of his sight. It was, he sobbed, the real prize. It detailed all the payments, not just to Sheriff Miller, but to a powerful agent for the Transcontinental Railroad, the man who had been the true silent partner in the arms trafficking scheme. The plan had been to use the stolen rifles to arm bandits, who would then attack the railroad's competitors, forcing the government to give them an exclusive and very lucrative security contract. Naichi found Pike's saddlebag, half buried in the muck. Inside, wrapped in the oilskin, was the ledger. It was all there, in Pike's neat, precise handwriting. The final, damning piece of evidence that would not only clear Nora's name, but would unravel a conspiracy that reached far beyond the dusty streets of Jericho. Nora stood in the wreckage of the pass, the rope still clutched in her raw hands. The red mud, the price of lies, had washed the slate clean. The battle for her home was over. A much larger battle, for a truer kind of justice, was about to begin. The journey to Prescott was a strange and silent procession. The United States Marshal and his deputies escorted the prisoners, a sullen and bedraggled collection of men who had been humbled by the raw power of the flood. Agent Pike, his legs splinted, rode strapped to his horse, his face a cold, unreadable mask. Whit Boyle was a weeping, broken creature. His brief moment of authority washed away, leaving only a terrified boy. Naichi and Nora rode with the Marshal's party, not as captives, but as the principal witnesses. their presence a constant, uncomfortable reminder to the other men of how thoroughly their world had been upended. Taza and his warriors followed at a distance, a silent, watchful honor guard ensuring that the white man's justice, having been set in motion, would not veer from its course. They rode through a land transformed. The rain had washed the air clean, and the prairie smelled of damp earth and new life. The colors were sharp and vivid, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. It felt like the world was taking its first clean breath after a long and terrible fever, and Nora felt a similar stirring in her own heart. The rage and the fear that had been her fuel for so long were beginning to recede, leaving behind a vast, quiet space, a landscape she was only just beginning to explore. The district courtroom in Prescott was a solid, imposing wooden structure, a building that smelled of old paper, floor polish, and the faint, lingering scent of human anxiety. It was packed to the rafters. News of the railroad conspiracy, the forged deeds, and the dramatic showdown at Dry Bone Pass had spread like wildfire. The room was a sea of faces, a mixture of stern-faced ranchers, curious townspeople, and soberly dressed officials who had come to witness the unraveling of a scandal that reached far higher than they had ever imagined. When Nora and Naichi entered, a wave of whispers followed them. Nora, in a simple, borrowed dress provided by the marshal's wife, held her head high. She was no longer the subject of lurid gossip. She was a woman who had fought back. Naichi walked beside her, his presence creating a circle of stillness around him. He moved with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any weapon, his gaze level, taking in the strange, enclosed world of the white man's law without fear or judgment. The trial was surprisingly swift. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The marshal presented Pike's ledger, its neat columns of figures a damning indictment of greed and corruption. He presented the forged deed alongside the certified copy of the original land grant. The documents lay side by side, a testament to a simple, arrogant lie. Doña Luz was the first to testify. She sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her voice clear and strong. She told of Sheriff Miller's first visit, his threats and intimidation. She told of Pike's quiet, menacing presence. She spoke with a simple, unshakable honesty that no lawyer's questioning could touch. When she stepped down, the moral foundation of Pike's and Miller's authority was in ruins. Sheriff Miller, seeing no way out, accepted a deal. He stood before the court, a diminished figure, and confessed to taking bribes and conspiring to obstruct justice. His voice was a low mumble, the sound of a man who had lost everything. Whit Boyle was next. He was a pathetic sight, his hands trembling. He confessed to everything, his words tumbling out in a desperate, self-serving rush. He implicated his dead brother, Thomas, in the forgery and the murder plot. He detailed Pike's instructions for the ambush in the Box Canyon. He confirmed every entry in the ledger, his testimony painting a sordid picture of a family consumed and destroyed by its own avarice. Through it all, Agent Pike sat silent and impassive. When his turn came, he offered no defense, called no witnesses. He was a professional, and he knew when the game was lost. He was convicted on all counts, his face betraying no emotion as the judge read the long list of his crimes. The railroad agent named in the ledger would be arrested the following week, and the scandal would shake the territorial government to its foundations. Before passing sentence, the judge asked if anyone else wished to speak. A silence fell over the room. Then, Naichi rose to his feet. He did not walk to the witness stand. He stood where he was, a tall, lean figure in the center of the crowded room. He looked at the judge, his dark eyes holding a wisdom that was far older than the laws written in the books on the judge's bench. When he spoke, his English was simple, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "We did not ask for this fight," he said. "My people have their own laws, their own ways. They are laws of the earth, of the seasons, of the sky. They teach us how to live in balance. We do not seek to take what is not ours." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent, upturned faces. "We want to live, and let others live." He said nothing more. He simply sat down. The silence he left behind was more profound than any applause. In those few, simple words, he had reframed the entire conflict. This was not just about a stolen ranch. It was about two ways of life, two different understandings of the world, and the simple, desperate desire for a place to exist in peace. Finally, the judge turned to Nora. He spoke to her directly, his voice softening with a respect she had not been shown since this ordeal began. He declared the deed forged by Thomas Boyle to be null and void. He legally affirmed her as the sole and rightful owner of the Double Creek Ranch and all its assets. He informed her that, due to the circumstances, she would receive a substantial insurance payment for the losses incurred under her brother-in-law's criminal mismanagement. All her personal property, what little of it remained, was to be returned to her. The law, which had been twisted into a weapon against her, had finally been made to serve the truth. Nora listened to the words, the legal phrases that were meant to restore her life. She felt a deep, profound sense of relief, but it was not the triumphant joy she might have once imagined. She had won, but the cost had been immense. She had traveled to the very edge of her own world and looked into the abyss. The woman who had left Jericho in a dusty morning dress no longer existed. That night, they returned to the Apache camp. The air was cool and clean, and the prairie, nourished by the recent rains, was beginning to show the first blush of new green. There was a sense of homecoming that Nora had never expected to feel for this hidden place of hide and smoke. Sani greeted them at the edge of the camp, his ancient eyes holding a deep and knowing peace. The danger had passed. The balance was restored. To give thanks for the rain, for the renewal of life, the people held a ceremony. A great fire was built in the center of the camp circle. As darkness fell, the flames leaped toward the star-filled sky, a beacon of warmth and light in the vast, open land. The people gathered around it, their faces painted by the flickering light. A drum began to beat, a slow, steady rhythm like the heartbeat of the earth itself. An old man began to chant, a song that was both a prayer and a story, a recounting of their people's endurance, their connection to the land, their gratitude for the gifts of survival. Nora stood in the circle, the silver eagle bracelet cool on her wrist. The warmth of the fire was on her face, the sound of the chanting all around her. This was the Hozho Sani had spoken of, the harmony, the beauty, the rightness of things. Naiche came to stand beside her. He did not take her hand, but his presence was a solid comfort, an anchor. He belonged here, in this circle of fire and song. And as he stood with her, not behind her or in front of her, but beside her, she knew that she belonged here, too. Taza, his face no longer hard with suspicion but calm with acceptance, gave them a slight nod from across the fire. Dazin watched them, a rare, small smile on her lips. Sani's eyes were closed, but he knew they were there. Before the eyes of the entire community, in the sacred circle of the fire, they stood together. It was a public declaration, more binding than any words spoken in a church, more official than any license signed in a courthouse. This was the confirmation of their family, a family of choice, forged in violence and tempered in loyalty. Nora looked from the fire to the face of the man beside her, his features softened by the warm light. She had lost a home of wood and stone, a life defined by a piece of paper, and in its place, under the wide Arizona sky, she had found a home in a circle of fire and in a warrior's heart. The return from Prescott was not a return to the life Nora had known. The legal papers in her satchel, the deed to the Double Creek Ranch, felt like artifacts from a forgotten country. The world expected her to ride back through the cottonwood trees, to unlock the door of the house she had shared with James, and to resume her existence as the widow Boyle. The thought was like a shroud. The ranch was a place of ghosts. It held the warm, loving memory of her husband, But that memory was now inextricably tangled with the bitter poison of his brother's betrayal. To live there would be to live in a house of sorrow, forever looking over her shoulder, forever sleeping in a bed that held both love and loss. She spent several days in the town, staying in a small, clean room at the hotel, a guest of the territory while the final legal threads were tied. She met with the lawyer Doña Luz had recommended, a kind, elderly man who helped her put her affairs in order. The insurance payment was substantial, and the sale of the ranch, which he handled for her, brought in even more. She was, by the standards of the world she had almost been cast out of, a wealthy woman. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. The lawyer asked her what she intended to do. Would she travel east, perhaps, back to a more civilized place where a woman of means could live in comfort? He saw a pale, fragile woman who had been through a terrible ordeal. He did not see the woman who had survived a dust storm, who had faced down a killer in a box canyon, who had found a home in a circle of fire. Her decision, when she voiced it, was so simple and yet so incomprehensible to him that he asked her to repeat it. She would not be leaving. She instructed him to use the bulk of the money from the sale of the ranch to purchase land. Specifically, she gave him a map. One night she had drawn for her in the dirt, and she had copied onto paper. It was a wide swath of territory. Thousands of acres of rugged, arid land that bordered the Apache reservation. It was considered worthless by most, too dry for cattle, too remote for settlement. But it contained the hidden springs, the sheltered canyons, the ancient hunting grounds that were the lifeblood of Sani's people. She bought it all. She used the white man's money and the white man's law to build a wall. Not of stone, but of paper. She created a legally recognized buffer zone, a sanctuary that no rancher, no prospector, no government agent could cross without her permission. The land would not be hers in title alone. It would be a shared space, a promise of coexistence made real. When her business was concluded, she did not ride west toward the ranch. She rode east, toward the rising sun, toward the mesas that held her future. Naichi met her on the trail, as she knew he would. He had waited for her, a silent, patient guardian, respecting her need to conclude her old life on her own terms. As they rode together, away from the towns and the courthouses and into the wide, open land, Nora felt the last of the weight fall from her shoulders. She was not returning to a place of shelter. She was, for the very first time, truly going home. They did not choose to live within the main camp. Their home needed to be a bridge, a place that belonged to both of their worlds, and to neither. They chose a spot on the edge of the land Nora had purchased, in a shallow valley sheltered by a stand of ancient junipers. A small, clear spring bubbled up from the rocks nearby, and the view looked out over the vast, sweeping grasslands. They built the house themselves, with help from their new family, Taza. His suspicion, now transformed into a fierce and protective loyalty, showed Naichi how to select the straightest, strongest pines for the roof beams. Dazin came with a group of women, their laughter echoing in the small valley as they mixed the adobe, their hands shaping the mud and straw bricks that would form the walls. They showed Nora how to plaster the walls smooth with a fine layer of clay, a skill passed down through generations. The house rose from the earth, a structure of blended knowledge. It had the thick, cool adobe walls of a desert dwelling, but it also had a wide, covered porch like the one Nora had loved at the ranch. It had glass windows, carefully transported from Prescott, that let in the brilliant desert light, and a large stone hearth that would provide warmth against the cold of winter nights. It was a small house, with only 2 rooms, but it felt larger than any place Nora had ever known. As they worked side by side, a new language formed between them, a language of shared tasks and easy silence. Nora learned the rhythm of his movements, the quiet way he assessed a problem before acting. He learned the determined set of her jaw when she was focused on a task, the soft sound of her humming when she was content. They were 2 people from different worlds, but in the shared work of building a home, They found a common ground that was stronger than any treaty. The seasons turned. The heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden days of autumn. The new grass on the prairie, which had sprouted after the rains, cured to a pale, silvery gold that rippled in the constant wind. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Nora tended her garden, a small patch of earth where she grew the herbs Dassen had taught her to use, alongside the familiar corn and squash. Nietzsche hunted, his excursions now taking him not through contested territory, but through the protected lands that were now a sanctuary. Sometimes Nora would ride with him, not to hunt, but simply to be in the vast, quiet wilderness, to learn the names of the plants and the habits of the animals, to feel the enduring freedom of the wind on her face. One clear, cool autumn morning, Nora sat at the small wooden table inside their home. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A fire crackled softly in the hearth. She had her small leather journal open before her. She had not written in it for many weeks. There had been no need. The story was no longer something she needed to record. It was something she was living. She turned the pages, her fingers tracing the lines of her own handwriting. She saw the frantic, terrified entries from her first days on the run. She saw the stark, simple account of the showdown in the canyon. She stopped at the page where she had written down the words Nietzsche had spoken in the storm. "I offer you my home and my heart." The memory was as clear and vivid as the morning light. She picked up her pencil. She thought for a long moment, not about what to write, but about how to frame the truth. Her story was not just about loss and survival. It was about finding a new beginning in the ashes of the old. Beneath the words he had spoken, she began to write, her script clear and steady. The words formed a title, a summation of the impossible journey that had led her to this quiet, sunlit room. Left penniless by her late husband's kin, an Apache war leader offered her a home and his heart. She read the sentence over, and a slow smile touched her lips. It was the truth, all of it, the cruelty and the kindness, the despair and the hope. She closed the book. The story of her past was now complete. The pages of her future were still blank, waiting to be written, day by day, moment by moment. She rose and stepped out onto the porch, into the warmth of the sun. The wind, that constant voice of the prairie, lifted a strand of her hair and brushed it against her cheek. It no longer felt like a mournful, lonely sound. It was the sound of freedom. Nietzsche was standing by the small horse corral, mending a piece of leather. He looked up as she approached, and the smile he gave her was as warm and bright as the morning itself. He met her halfway, taking both of her hands in his. His touch was familiar, comforting, a safe harbor. He did not speak, but his eyes said everything. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and took something out. It was another silver bracelet. This one was simpler than the one Dassen had given her, a single, smooth band of polished metal, but it was etched with the same powerful image of a soaring eagle. He had made it for her himself. He slid it onto her wrist beside the other one. They chimed softly together, a quiet, metallic music. It was not a shackle, not a brand of ownership. It was a promise, a symbol of their shared flight, their shared strength, their shared future. It was the final, unbreakable seal on the vow he had made in the storm. Nora looked down at the two bracelets, the two eagles circling her wrist. She looked up at the man who stood before her, his hand still holding hers. She looked out at the vast, sun-drenched prairie that stretched to the horizon, a land that had tested her, broken her, and had ultimately given her a home. The wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant pines, a promise of endurance, of a life of peace, of a love that was as strong and as free as the land itself. Thank you for listening to the story, and we invite you to comment where you are listening from so everyone can connect and share their thoughts. Subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.